Monty Scott is a brilliant stand-up comedian from Scarborough, Ontario. His 2019 comedy album, The Abyss Stares Back, was nominated for a Juno Award, and while it didn't win Comedy Album of the Year, it still represents a real victory. Scott recorded it in part as a response to a near-death experience. We talk in this conversation about bouncing back, about the lives and livelihoods of comedians in Canada. We speak to the politics of comedy today and try to imagine ways of thinking about comedy as an art. There are practical reasons for trying to figure out ways of defining comedy in these terms. As I discussed in my article for The Breach, getting comedy recognized this way in Canada would open up funding opportunities for a creative community that was hit very hard by the temporary and permanent closure of many venues during the pandemic. But it's also a theoretical question. There are entrenched assumptions about what art is and what it should do. Changing the definition is slow, difficult work, and yet Scott suggests there's a path to getting comedy gradually recognized as a legitimate art. He emphasizes, first of all, that it's already an obviously relevant art form. It's a live conversation, it's popular, people need it. He says it may even be foundational to our existence. Nonetheless, getting comedy recognized as an art is still a major objective of the Canadian Association of Stand-Up Comedians, the organization for which Monty currently acts as president. A shift is already happening on the provincial level, he says, but it remains a struggle. His gut tells him that the most important thing here is to listen to the people, to take them seriously, and trust that the work comedians can accomplish when they move out of a purely individualistic space and into solidarity with one another can actually achieve something transformative. Another area where he says we gain a lot of clarity from listening to the people is on the question of shifting levels of tolerance and the politics of comedy. While he admits that his own comedy is in many ways grounded in being truly silly, he gets that there's a changing political climate around comedy. Still valuing the power of humor to go to uncomfortable places, while also understanding that there's a fine line between challenging norms and seeking shock for its own sake is a tricky thing. But I appreciated his point that shock value has little real value, and that there's an important contradiction between people casually laughing at stereotypes and getting offended by the willingness to explicitly identify racism. We talk a bit about what we might call the geography of comedy in Canada. Maybe unsurprisingly, he says that smaller towns have a real desire for you to speak to their specific context. But he also tells us that there's a weird discrepancy in places like Toronto between audiences that are genuinely uptight and ones that are pretty nihilistic, to use his term. I was struck by the fact that, in his experience, audiences in Alberta typically don't care much about social norms or the implicit rules that impact what counts as sensitive or appropriate discourse. In Alberta, he says you don't really need to filter what you say, and he seems, in fact, a little unnerved by that. Overall, though, he's learned that some of his initial anxieties about not being able to connect with people in a variety of different places in Canada with predominantly white audiences, given that he's a mixed-race person from Scarborough, that, these anxieties were a bit unfounded. That said, he also admits that in Canadian comedy, being a person of color means facing a real struggle to avoid being stereotyped. In the face of that push to simplify one's perspective and make one's comedy digestible and maybe even stereotypical, he points out that there's a real fusion in Canadian society and that we need a shift in perspective on immigration, inclusion, to radically embrace diversity. This also means taking seriously what sorts of racially stratified impacts the pandemic has had in Canada and really worldwide. This is bigger than comedy, but it also implicates humor in a number of different ways. The thing I wanted to ask you about first was just what sort of your almost philosophical or like political perspective is on comedy, if you have one.
Philosophically, I mean, I don't know. I don't know if I've thought about it like, philosophically like that. I think about in the idea that it's relevant culturally and it's relevant. You know, I look at it more. It is, of course, relevant culturally, but I look at it like intrinsically human. Like you cannot have a culture without it.
Mm-hmm.
Can't have humanity without it. So
Yeah.
it's intrinsic to us no matter what. So obviously it's an art form that's important because there's almost nothing. It's foundational to our existence.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I kind of look at it from that point of view. And culturally, it's obviously Canadian culture is. We pride ourselves, or at least I think the country prides itself on producing comedians.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously it's important. Mike Myers, I think it was Mike Myers' quote where he said that we don't watch TV, we watch American TV, and that's one of the reasons we produced a lot of comedians is we have a somewhat arm's length view at even our own culture.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I would definitely I agree with that point of view, but uh, like I say, I mean, sure, it's important to Canadian culture, but in truth, I'm sure every other country feels the same way to an extent.
Mm-hmm.
Because like really, it's a manifestation of humanity, comedy. So
Yeah. It's almost a drive. I think that's true.
totally, I mean, there's just no doubt, and it's fundamental to our our thinking process in that it's almost like the missing link to moving us from animal to what we call human, is it's the objectivity of humor, I think, that is like it's fundamental even in our if you want to say we rising above the animals or rising to the top of the animal species, like from our the understanding that we exist and we are here is almost fundamental to humor.
Yeah, I take that point. You know what I mean? Like, just expression, artistic expression is such a kind of a tipping point in some ways in terms of like, yeah, like the evolution of self-awareness and all that stuff, being able to laugh at yourself,
Yeah.
for sure. And like I think but the difference, I guess, is like if you're a professional comedian, you start off kind of like maybe a little bit clumsy, a little bit crude, not having refined your craft, and then you refine it, right? And you become, you obtain that level of like artistry where people begin to think, wow, this person is like almost a visionary, right? Like there are comedians who are looked at in that way, who have produced comedy specials that are looked at almost like these events, right? When Eddie
Mhm.
Murphy makes Delirious at age like 21 or whatever, it's seen as this like, moving all of comedy forward in some ways, and then it becomes this touchstone for other comedians. I know you've mentioned Delirious in other, conversations. Are there specific specials, maybe even like recent specials, that stand out for you in that way of like kind of moving comedy forward?
Yeah, definitely. Well, as you mentioned, Delirious is as a child, and,
Mm-hmm.
I'd say Chris Rock's. I think it's Bigger and Blacker.
Mm-hmm.
That
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 was huge.
special was huge, and for me as kind of a young adult and thinking about doing comedy personally, but I think industry wide it was that kind of thing. Then you have stuff like I think the Chappelle show, even though not as maybe some of his specials, but I'd say just that show itself as a touchstone for comedy was it's not stand up, but it was really crazy. Many of the things Bill Burr has done in the last 10 years, I think Bill Burr's talent is being able to channel his maniac into it's always a core truth. You know what I mean? Like these people are always um, speaking so much truth almost that society to an extent can barely handle it, and
Yeah,
I always feel that
in a
like
way.
almost
Yeah.
all of those albums are on the touchstone of that. Like almost all these great albums are like they're bringing so much clarity to our reality that it's almost difficult to take.
Chappelle is being, he's still a rich comedian who's supported by Netflix, but there are many events that are being canceled as part of this backlash against his transphobia.
Hmm.
And Burr has, as you say, he's alienated some audiences because of his like politically incorrect, I guess would be the way to put it, style. And I guess I wanted to ask you about like the current moment for comedy in the era, I guess, of what's called, I think, too quickly and simplistically cancel culture. I
Hmm.
think, obviously it's different when CK is actually, exposed for sexual misconduct and like other people are just saying things that offend. But I at least am in the position of saying like, I'm done with Dave Chappelle for the most part. And I liked Chappelle's show, but Chappelle's The Closer special, for personal and political reasons for me was just like a line in the sand in some ways where, his doubling down and Netflix doubling down is just like not for me a place I can go to. And that's just, I mean, this is maybe the era of political division in some ways, but I guess I want to ask, like, do you feel like audiences are more politically conscious or informed now, and that's what's part of like what's going on? And how does the level of political awareness that you sense in an audience shift the jokes that you feel you can do as a comedian?
Well, I think obviously people. I wouldn't say sensitivity, but there is a wider, obviously a wider range, and these are topics that were always kind of well, as we've moved through the years, um, you get these topics as they come up. At first it was just gay people, just being a homosexual, and then moving forward is again like levels of tolerance as you move forward. I think it's perfectly fine. Also, that if you personally are like, well, you know what, I don't like what he was saying about this. It's kind of a given, really. It's not
Mm-hmm.
even so much cancel culture as it is. I listen to some various people talk about. In this case, it was Black Lives Matter. That I really enjoyed what they were doing, but they kind of turned me off from their attitude with it because they took a stance on it I didn't like. As far as I thought negatively portraying it in a way I didn't believe in. So I just kind of a
Right.
little bit walked away from it. I didn't say, "Hey, I hate this person. I'll never deal with them again." But I that attitude turned me off, and I kind of stepped away. And I think that's gonna obviously perfectly fair to happen for you and Chappelle. But I do think I haven't heard like exactly Chappelle's stances on these, so I am ignorant in that manner because I've kind of heard people speak on both sides of it. But I think the idea that they're willing to take on these discussions and hopefully not in a frivolous way, not just for
Mm-hmm.
the clicks or how much for the clicks. I would imagine Dave Chappelle's not doing it for the clicks or the idea of some sort of relevance. I feel like he wants to talk about it for a particular reason.
Well, yeah, he
I'd
does
hope.
say though. I mean, like, I think you're right. Like he does, for example, like people have pointed out that he's been really obviously like insightful on anti-black racism, for example. But it's like he's limited in terms of understanding like gender politics, and he doesn't want to learn is the problem, I think. And the one thing he says
Sure.
in the Bird Revelation, I think, is the special is that he says mean things on purpose, but not because they're mean, because they are funny, right? So it's like there is a way in which I think he's a little bit leaning into the shock value of being kind of publicly cruel in a way, right? Like at
Right.
least shocking to some extent. And that is a style of comedy. It's just when does sort of the culture shift and are comedians open to shifting their comedy in response seems to be like one of the questions. And like in Canada, that seems to be differently political. Like we're talking a lot when we talk about cancel culture. Largely, I feel like we're talking about the U.S. because of the size of that market. But like you have this joke on your comedy album, "The Abyss Stares Back," where you talk about your like background, your Guyanese and Scottish, and you joke about the audience needing to identify your racial background in order to like fully understand you. And you do it in obviously a comedic style, right? Like you're not trying to preach necessarily. The idea is to frame it as a joke, but it does feel like what you're partly trying to do is like give audiences the opportunity to think critically about their own racism potentially, right? Is that like a capacity that you think comedy has, is to kind of like just sort of tease that out without being preachy, basically?
Well, I hope I didn't think about it even as I was doing that joke, but I do hope it does that because that's how organically that's how I feel about it. I find it odd
Mm-hmm.
that having to know what somebody is as opposed to like I'm speaking English just the same as you pretty
Mm-hmm.
clearly. Um, but that is kind of more my thing. Like I say, I don't like the idea of doing comedy for shock value, and like you say, saying things that are borderline or completely mean in order to get a laugh. I'm not on board for like that style really at all.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think when I quibble with the say the culture in general, when you talk about cancel, I don't like the idea that people are scared and unwilling to approach thoughts. And
Mm-hmm.
I hopefully, because that's sometimes comics will get into trouble where they're only exploring a thought as to what is this and how does this fit in and what is it, right? That's kind of what we do.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's a hot button topic, and people are unable to kind of see past the hot button and explore the actual thought as to what it is. And for that, I have a lot of time for, and I think comedy has um, should have a really big place for it, because a lot of times thinking about these things are uncomfortable, and the only way to take down that kind of medicine is with some sweetness of the humor.
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully, and I think traditionally that's comedy has done that a lot, and made that happen a lot, but it is a fine line. It's a fine line between being just kind of a little kind of shock value style and mean,
Mm-hmm.
and even though this is an uncomfortable thought, there may be a lot of truth in it, and those two get mixed up a lot, and it's frustrating. Like I've noticed personally, sometimes you do a joke essentially critiquing racism, in some
Mm-hmm.
manner or another, and people will get angry because it's a critique of racism, but they take it as racism because they looking at it at face value, and then at the same time they'll laugh at a joke that is completely stereotype driven, which is just completely racism,
Right.
and they're totally cool with that. You'll never have a complaint walking into that, but walking into something where you might be saying something that's quasi racism in a facetious way to highlight racism,
Mm-hmm.
and people will take that as racism, and so basically they do the reverse all the time.
And it seems like a big part of it is like who is speaking. I mean, it comes down to like, I know Carol Zocoli. You've done Sandra's podcast and spoken with her.
Oh yeah.
She's from Brazil and talks about how like Canadian audiences, there's like a kind of liberal sentimentality or something that makes it hard to go to a place of laughing with her about things like poverty and things like structural racism, because it's seen as you say, like a hot button topic or just off limits. Janelle Niles, I talked to her as well, and she talks about like the struggle in Ottawa of like trying to warm up audiences that she says sort of feels like they've taken a module on what that day on why the things she's saying aren't funny. um, so it
Right.
has everything to do with it sounds like what you're saying, like who is speaking and who gets to kind of play with these stereotypes and who doesn't. And I guess like I want to ask you about different contexts in Canada. I know you just performed at various places on the East Coast where I'm located, and like what your I guess what your experience here was, how it compares to Ontario, other Canadian cities, like which tend to be more progressive or inclusive audiences, which tend to be audiences that are a little bit more like open to being challenged, and which ones are kind of more conservative when it comes to the kind of geography of comedy in Canada.
Well, first of all, love the East Coast. Great time, and I've always had a great time there, and I've always found the audiences to be. Now, what I'll put a bit of a caveat on this is like a lot of times, in my opinion at least, a lot of times my comedy is really just truly silly, and
Mm-hmm.
it may involve other aspects of obviously our society and life, but it, one of the kind of things that smooths me over a lot is the utter, I think, silliness of it. So it's always kind of grounded in that. So it's not, I'm not
Right.
rarely am I doing something that's so kind of hard hitting to an exact point. I have more of nuance points, I guess, around jokes.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
A lot of it's like self-effacing.
yeah, obviously self-effacing is always you can badmouth yourself as much as you want, but a lot of times it's kind of like. I used to do a political joke about Stephen Harper where I'm saying like my biggest beef with him is that his lips are the same color as his face, and and then that usually get a big laugh because there's some core of truth in that, but it tends to be it's a if that's your political commentary, you shouldn't get in a hell of a lot of trouble
Mm-hmm.
politically.
Sure.
Um, but I do find, like, say for the East Coast, I found them pretty comparable. I've always found them pretty comparable to Ontario.
Mm-hmm.
I think for any kind of, I'd say this is true for just about everywhere in smaller centers, particularly they, like small towns anyway. They like you to talk about them. There's a big portion that
Sure.
they like you to talk about them in some manner or another, right? And
Mm-hmm.
actually probably literally everywhere, but it particularly comes out in smaller towns. But and I'd say that countrywide and probably worldwide, right? But
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
from each to like, I'd say there's a certain amount of, like, they're just pretty easygoing. I found in the East Coast, I found for the shows they were, even I did a few shows that were kind of oriented towards safe space style, quote unquote.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't. Rarely would I find very constricting anyway. But I found the audiences to be just kind of open minded and cool, and really, I didn't find them from the point of view like overly fixated on, say, my looks or my race or whatever. They're just kind of like, all right, like, say Toronto can get a little bit uptight from
Interesting.
political correctness point of view occasionally.
Mm-hmm.
In various spots, say downtown and whatnot, but mostly Toronto's pretty nihilistic and they don't really care. And
Mm-hmm.
I found out west, Alberta really just doesn't care. Bordering sometimes on they don't care enough. You know what I mean? It'd be like sometimes
Yeah. Yeah.
if you do a joke, you're like, I don't know if they'll take this racially, and then sometimes you're like, well, I mean, they seem a little too happy.
Yeah. What did I just open up there? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like, they seem to dig that too much, but they're pretty just like, say whatever you want if it's funny. They don't have a lot of filter on what's making them laugh. They don't have a lot of like, should I be laughing?
Mm-hmm.
And Toronto mostly doesn't either, but like I say, some spots downtown. I didn't think the East Coast did at all, really, that I could tell. And Vancouver and like BC, I found them to be a little more like that, but I only had a relatively minimal experience out there. I've only been out there for like 3 weeks, kind of combined, where it's not even fair to me to speak of them as a, because mostly, I'd say mostly audiences are audiences like all the way across. I found when I was touring, I was like, I don't know, how am I going to get across to people in northern Alberta or something. I'm like a mixed kid from Scarborough. How could I they like what I like or laugh at what I think, and I found that there's no need for any separation.
Right. And I mean, like, part of it is that they want to hear your story. Like, they want you to tell your story, to give your own kind of perspective. I
Mhm.
have some questions about, like, the pressure, I guess, in some ways of doing that, especially in this contemporary, like, gig economy, where part of what we're commodifying is our own, like, persona, right? It has to be like this coherent, cohesive thing, and sort of polished in some ways, like, people just have to get it. And like, whether that's difficult at all. But I guess I wanted to jump off something you said there about, the degree to which your very, like, identity in some ways, like, precedes you, or like conditions the audience in certain ways depending on the place. Like, you now are the president of CASC, the Canadian Association of Stand-Up Comedians, and it
Mhm.
does have, like, these specific objectives. Obviously, one of the big objectives is what you call the cycle of advancement, ensuring the production, promotion, distribution of Canadian comedy. But the other one is to promote a harassment-free environment, to promote, like, racial, social, economic, physical, mental, and gender justice and equality. And, like, it is the case that is a lot of people pointed out, that there is now a greater, like, hunger market, whatever you want to say, for, like, a diverse cross section of different sort of stories, performers. There seems to be, basically since 2020 and the uprising of Black lives, a greater sense of, like, how there's inherent value in some ways in having more diverse perspectives at the table. How, to what extent is that second objective, now, with you stepping in as president, like, part of the mission of CASC? Like, is doing justice basically to the diversity of your membership.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned. I don't know that it changes much from, say, Sandra being president to me, because I think we're
Mm-hmm.
very much of like minds with it. But for me personally, it's a real personal issue to me, because I honestly found okay, I found in the comedy industry, at least this is my take on it, is that if you're ethnic, and for anyone who hasn't seen me, I just look kind of more or less um, Hispanic, I suppose you could say. It really irked me, the idea that I'm a Canadian. My mom is from Guyana, but I never identify myself as Guyanese, because I'm not. I've only been to
Mm-hmm.
Guyana once. My dad is from Brockville, but he's Scottish, like we're the Scott clan, but he's never been to Scotland. So, how Scottish am I and how Guyanese? At least I have a Guyanese family around me. I'm really just a person who knows Guyanese people. And
Right.
so the idea that I would come in and talk a whole bunch about my skin color, to me is insulting to an extent, because I'm like,
Mm.
why? I always took it as like, the feeling in the industry was, um, well, this guy's going to come in here and tell jokes about his socks. We could get a white guy to talk about socks.
Hmm.
Why? What the hell's the point of having somebody who looks like an immigrant come in here and not talk about his ethnicity? So my one of my biggest things is, like, until we recognize that I am what Toronto is to a large extent, and what our country is. I'm a microcosm of immigration and the integration of immigration into our country. And until we realize that we're not like a bunch of different ethnic people walking around, we're all, we're becoming more and more mixed, and becoming more fusion all the time. And at some point, we have to recognize this is Canadian.
Mm-hmm.
My experience is not abnormal; it is Canadian. Being like a person mixed between a number of different cultures, it shouldn't be like I have to talk about what curried haggis, like what, why,
Yeah.
and it's insult, it's wrong, and it's not facing the reality of what we are, and I think it would be greatly beneficial for our entire uh, comedy industry to recognize, like, this is what Canada is.
Mm-hmm.
Sure, you could be a white guy from anywhere, and be like visually what you'd picture a Canadian, but your experience, but anyone's experience is going to be, mixed in with mine, knowing a bunch of people that are ethnic in various different ways, that are Canadians, that are here, that are not only here, but I mean, I always talk about like being an immigrant. I'm born in North York. I am not an immigrant.
Mm-hmm.
But you feel that way because my mom is, and so sometimes my girlfriend will be like, I'll say I'm an immigrant, she'll say I'm not, but then if somebody called me an immigrant, I'd be like, excuse me, I'm born here, So it's like, I'm pissed no matter where you think I am from, I guess, uh, but it's this kind of dichotomy that I think it's way more inherent in all of our all through our society, and from everybody's point of view, and
Mm-hmm.
uh, it's like I say, it's personal for me, but I think it's important for Cask, and it's important for our industry to recognize what we are as a country, not what we were in 1955. You know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I hear what you're saying, and I like this kind of comparison that I'm hearing you kind of draw between sort of like a superficial and kind of tokenistic attitude toward difference, basically, like people of color, that says like your experience is like sort of valuable in some ways to the white mainstream, like it's always kind of answerable to that, because it's different and so we can sell it or whatever, versus a more like serious interest in what Cask is about, which is like trying to level the playing field in some ways, because like it is the case that the coronavirus pandemic not only hit uh the arts community and performers particularly hard, but of course like it tore through communities of color in a disproportionately destructive way. And so like it'd be different if like that interest in diversity was that deep, of like, well, we need a serious transformation in this country, which is a white supremacist country in a lot of ways still. And so
Mhm.
I think like the saying you're pissed no matter what is interesting, because it's like anger is appropriate. I know, you were quoted in this Toronto.com article as saying that like there's going to be a decent proportion of really good artists that will lose due to COVID, which will be a shame. And I have to think that, it won't be just all artists, that there will be some that maybe can weather the storm and come back. And I guess, like you also say in that article that this needs to represent a big impetus for change. I get, this is a way for me to kind of get you to maybe talk about hopefully your the reasons why you stepped in as president of Cask. I know it's not a paid position necessarily, so in some ways you're doing it because you care. So what brought you to it, and what do you hope to do with the responsibilities that it comes with?
I guess I'll start by talking like what you're saying, like kind of tokenism and whatnot.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
100%. Yeah. First of all, COVID obviously hit artists terribly because, particularly performing artists, because you can't perform.
Yeah.
But beyond that, like how it's hit poor and ethnic communities harder. And the idea is like, it's great to say, oh yeah, we care, but it would be nice to help. You know,
Sure.
put the
Yeah.
impetus on helping and not having those situations happen, as opposed to or mitigating the problems of those situations rather than some sort of token words or the important thing to remember is actually helping. And
Mm-hmm.
as far as Cass goes, the reason I was very much on board when Sandra put it together and we all started it. But I mean, Sandra was the impetus of everything for it to start. But I was on board because I knew it was important. Comedians are naturally disenfranchised, so they're easy to either exploit or, if not exploit, take advantage of them in some manner or another because they're alone, always on an island, and they're always used to that
Mm-hmm.
scenario. So I thought it's really important to, very much in this case, oddly, it's ironic, but give voice to the voiceless.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Considering we all have microphones and talk garbage all day long, uh, somehow we're voiceless, but we're voiceless because we're always been, kind of pit against each other, and I don't mean this as to only point fingers at other people. The way the nature of comedians and whatnot, they tend to be lone and they go about this kind of solo type career, and you create a situation where you can't even talk to a collective of them. So how would anyone even ever try? Even
Yeah.
if somebody was like, "Hey, we're gonna cut like some sort of break for comedians," who would you talk to? And so, as if anyone's ever going to really try that, but, say they were, what would be the best thing for us to give you guys? Up until Cask, you wouldn't have even had anyone to talk
Mm-hmm.
to say,
Yeah.
to give you an answer, so that alone is just kind of proves the importance of it because again, it's a kind of lone group of disparate people going in different directions. So it's hugely important to first of all be there just to be a voice for the comedians, first and foremost, and then moving forward as you go, you continue to push the the agenda of better working conditions for us across the board, in every manner, fair pay and um, as many people probably listening know, in this world, a lot of times, if you're not asking for something, you're not getting it. And so, um, somebody there to say, "Hey, what about us?" in some manner or another. It could be, anywhere along the topic of our entire industry is like, "What about us?" And it would be nice for us to be thought of. And unless there's a voice for that, they're the easiest people to forget,
Mm-hmm.
even though they're the product.
Exactly. Yeah. They're on the stage. Like they're, yeah, as you say, the voice. But then there's this displacement effect because the structure, and I like that you point out, it's not about, it's maybe partly the fact that, the comedian, the vision of the comedian is like this lone wolf, as you say, like the individual voice, the singular hot take, all that stuff. But it's not a product of that. It's a product of the structure, the environment, this competitive circuit, that kind of makes you exploitable in some ways. Like, and what I'm hearing you say again is that, you need to ask to get things, but also you need to connect with others to create any sort of collective vision. And I think like that is so much of like how Cask is kind of like instructing comics, is to say like, this is what you've been sold, this idea and ideal of what a comedian is, but what would it mean? Like, what could we kind of envision if we, thought of ourselves as part of a collective? Like, that is amazing to me, like that idea of just solidarity, right?
Oh, very much like work in a collective of people. Even though I mean, essentially, we are by nature individualists, but
Hmm.
together we need to work together in the manner of just at least us, doing our work.
Yeah. And like, this is something that I know Sandra has said, is that, after the pandemic, there's no real going back to the way things were, because that status quo was broken. She says like the style that we were operating in, just it didn't work. And so, going back to normal, which has been, the kind of like, it's been the marching, the like the anthem of this kind of return to normal in this country and elsewhere. It really doesn't work, especially when you're talking about this specific sector of the creative economy in Canada that is still struggling for like legitimacy, right? So you're like picking up that baton of trying to, like, for example, petition governments for greater labor mobility. This is one of the objectives of Cask. And I guess I wanted to ask you about that in relationship to, the flow of creative talent to and from the U.S. Like, why is it difficult for Canadian comedians to crack the U.S. market? Um, you know, and given how difficult it clearly is to crack that market, some do it, of course, but there's challenges, and I wonder if you could speak to those challenges. It's clearly the case that given how difficult it is to crack, there needs to be more public funding here in Canada. Why don't we also have that for Canadian comedians?
Really glad you asked that. From first of all, Americans to perform here, it's a minimal cost to come here for a relatively short period of time. Say you wanted to come for a tour, you can tour all of Canada for like 2 months, and Americans have to pay like $100 to come here. You can't
Hmm.
step foot in the United States as a Canadian to earn a single cent. Under basically, you've got to file some sort of immigration claim. Either you need to get like a temporary visa, working visa there, and this costs thousands and thousands of dollars. So, for
Hmm.
whatever reason, the Canadian government said, "Hey, sure, you can come here for like the cost of basically a parking permit or something for one
Hmm.
month. I mean, a parking permit for 1 month. Here, give us $100. You can come here for like 2 months, 3 months, whatever. Make as much money of our money as you want. Displace our comedians, and in that you're taking their place, and go home. We go over to the United States. They're like, "What are you, crazy? You're going to take one of our citizens' jobs?" And basically, that's the situation you're working in. I don't know why it was started like that. Maybe there wasn't as many performers here, and we were just happy to have them come here, or maybe we were bullied as often as the case by the United States in some manner or another. It's hard to get the Canadian government to address these things because they're always concerned about so many different immigration things. They're like, well, if we get them to do this, they're going to want this. I don't know what the deal is exactly, but those type of things are huge for us. The idea, if we could go to the United States for a month, and for in the same, just a reciprocal agreement between our countries, that would be fantastic. So we're getting treated vastly different. For some reason, Canada is treating Americans vastly different than Americans are treating Canadians when it comes to performing live performances, and that's just the way it is. So, that being said, when it comes to the allocation of our own country's funds for comedians, we are still working, and our main goal to this day is working at having art designated, comedy designated art in our country. For
Hmm.
some reason, I think one of the reasons is that it's been um, self-sufficient to the point that people like comedy, so they go to it.
Right. There's a
There's
market for it. Yeah.
there's a market for it. There's many other arts that there aren't a market for, so they're essentially completely propped up by the Canadian government, and
Hmm.
we've been left on the outside of that discussion, and they don't want to let us in.
Hmm.
The other arts don't want to let us in because they don't want to. I don't think they want to let us have a piece of the pie because they know that it's a relevant concern to average citizens in our country. They'd be like they would want Canadians comedians funded at least to the same extent as the rest of the arts. But it's only up until now that they're starting to allow some degree of grants for comedians, but they still have not designated us an art. And when you go to get a grant or something, you can't just walk in and say it's for a comedy tour or something like that. You're always trying to squeeze in to something that's designed for something else. Like you're talking about something that's essentially designed for like either a play or dance or something like that. You're trying to squeeze into something, some sort of theater production, um, and say, well, let comedy in like that, rather than saying comedy is as relevant as theater, as an art, and let the person be judged on what they're proposing as comedy.
Hmm.
So that's what we're fighting for very much. Now, like I say, I don't know why we're on. One of the reasons we're on the outside of that is these other arts have associations. We never did,
Yeah. Yeah.
and maybe it was because people could make a little bit of money doing comedy, so it wasn't as relevant. I don't know, but that's the system you're trying to get in. So a lot of times when I was early in comedy, people were saying, "Oh, some government's going to cut art funding," and I was like, somebody asked me about it, and I was like, I mean, as a comedian, I'm like, I don't care at all. I care the same as, an insurance broker does, because I'm not getting any of that money anyway.
Mm.
I would only care philosophically for the arts.
Right. But the personal
Because
stake wasn't there. Yeah.
yeah, no personal stake for me, even being a comedian. So that is something that's probably our number one agenda. Is from the time we started Cask was to have comedy designated as art, and it's moved a little bit down the line, and the province of Quebec has done it, and BC is in the process of at least, but that's provincially, and federally. A lot of the money comes federally. So at some point, we need the federal system to be changed so that we're designated as an art. So
Yeah, it's really interesting, like to think about just that dynamic between the economy, just letting it rip and saying like the free market will decide, and the assumption that comedy is self-sustaining, actually producing conditions where there is no support. And now like at this point now where you have a collective voice and you're able to say like this is our sense of like who we are as a culture and the place of comedy in it. I think that could be obviously like the hope is that could be really transformative. But I guess like the problem is that you're not just up against the assumption that comedy is self-sustaining, that there's a market for it, but also I think this assumption that comedy is a vulgar art, that it's not like the ennobling arts, ballet, drama, or whatever. Can't I know that scanning the Cask Instagram, there's this post where you talk about how the Canada Council for the Arts representative said basically, where do we draw the line if we're qualifying comedy as an art? It's like everything becomes art, which is so weird to me. It feels to me like part of the goal is to part of the goal has to be actually like coming up with like a set of terms, a discourse for like saying the vulgar, the vernacular is itself legitimate. That like allowing people space to work through, as you were saying earlier, maybe some of the more challenging stuff that is part of being in a society, like some of the more kind of underground subcultural stuff, that we need to be less afraid of that Sandra was talking about Shakespeare, for example, as something that is like somehow just spontaneously going to like enlighten people. When it's like Shakespeare was the vulgar art of his day, right?
Yeah.
Like, how do we come up with a different set of terms for like saying, comedy may be vulgar, but vulgar isn't necessarily bad?
Well, look at how much politeness hides vulgarity in brutality.
Well put. Yeah, for sure.
Like as you mentioned Shakespeare. I mean, yeah, like you say, the original vulgarity. Vulgar art, right? I don't even know like where where the like line is for that. I feel like that's just some sort of um, somebody's own personal judgment that they don't like it. And I think we're probably finding that a lot through the other arts. And again, I think honestly, the other arts are some other arts are some resentful of the popularity of comedy, right? It's just naturally brings out like you want to point at something about comedy and say, "Oh, that's why that's not art." Just because you don't like the idea that people like it. I think there's something to that. But at some point, you have to recognize that people that are discussing some of the most important topics, i i and they're bringing that into the field of spoken word art,
Hmm.
um, that's important. I mean, the harp isn't important, but the harp, isn't as relevant to our society as discussing in a comedic spoken word form the most important things that are happening to our society right now, particularly now. We're in a tumultuous time, and will probably remain so for who knows how long. Our society, and talking about things that matter. And admittedly, comedy doesn't always talk about things that matter, but it's like music. Like the worst pop song is not indicative of everything that music is.
Hmm.
And you could say the same for comedy. The better part of what comedy is as relevant as any other piece of art that we have right now. So um, uh, getting that across the I don't know how much of a discussion we need to have with the arts community or whatever, but at some point there has to be an impetus to say this is what it is, and the thing is, the rest will take care of itself because of the popularity of comedy.
Hmm. Yeah, I think you're right.
People know it's relevant, and people are compelled to listen to it.
Yeah, I mean it's has a long tradition. I mean, it's like Cliff Nestoroff has a couple of books on this. This Canadian academic. His newest book, "We Had a Little Real Estate Problem," is about Indigenous comedy in Canada. And yeah, like there's a way in which now that's an issue that is suddenly finally at the foreground of Canadian politics. Is the question of reconciliation, reparations, being in good relation with Indigenous nations. It's like, if you want to actually have some kind of, broad conversation, it can't necessarily always happen within academic and political circles. It should also be happening in like these more like vernacular, everyday, like vulgar spaces, right? The question of the line and to what extent people are like offended, that also has to be part of the conversation, people's sensitivity and all that stuff. But um, I mean, even online, like the toxicity of online discourse isn't necessarily conducive to like progressive politics, right? This is part of the thing that like the alt right, for example, has really in some ways contaminated satire, irony, and so on with like real racism, like virulent racism. And so like having these venues supported with funding, these venues that have disappeared in the context of the pandemic, resuscitate in some ways like a public sphere where we don't really have a public sphere anymore.
100%.
There is kind of a conversation happening like in these spaces. It's lively, it's alive.
Yeah, it's a live conversation, which, yeah, as much as the internet, part of the problem with the internet is often not a live conversation, or
Yeah.
it's not a face to face, which has brought out so much of this ridiculous kind of talk, really. But at the same time, as toxic and detrimental as what a lot of things that have happened on the internet, we don't endeavor to say the internet is useless or toxic
True.
entirely to us, right? So, I mean, God knows comedy hasn't done anything as bad as the alt-right has on the internet.
Mm-hmm.
So surely you can't throw out the little bit of upfront crass or maybe vapid comedy and throw that out with the rest of the comedy out with a bathwater. We didn't do it with the internet. We're still on the internet and we want to be on the internet. And look at all the damage it's done.
Mm-hmm. And so I guess the last question I'll ask is about, just who gets to make these sorts of determinations in a way. Like we like to say it's the public, social media. We like to imagine social media as this like meritocracy, but there are like in some ways invisible forces of legitimation, delegitimation. In the case of the internet, like Elon Musk tries to buy Twitter, and there's this like backlash that says, well, we don't want necessarily a completely wide open like frontier for hate speech and so on, and that's what he's going to produce. There are, even though we imagine social media as this sort of like unregulated space, there are large companies that curate it. And you drew the analogy to music. I think like that's a useful one when it comes to comedy. And I know Sandra talks about how music has been a big ally in some ways for comedians, like organizing.
Yeah.
Music, it's certainly valid economically, but it also has this like cultural capital attached to it as well. So I think like cracking that code, figuring out how legitimation, delegitimation happens, will be sort of like hopefully a little bit of a like a ticket for comedy to achieve that like status of being not just enjoyed and celebrated in certain ways, but like Canadian comedy specifically, comedians producing humor in Canada, receiving the support. Like it's gonna, in some ways, I think, happen by deciphering the means through which art is either legitimated or delegitimated. Even though, as you say, like your comedy is silly, you're trying to work through now in your role as president of CASC, like how that process of legitimation and delegitimation happens.
Yeah.
Any
Uh,
thoughts on that?
well, I guess I'd start off by saying, is like I used to fully believe in free speech from the idea that I thought things like hate speech and stuff. Um, it's like if when you pull something into the sunlight, it's a disinfectant. So I always thought the idea of people hiding in shadows, talking, to me, is essentially garbage. Bring them to the sunlight, and people will see how bad this is. See how wrong-headed it is. And as it turns out, like just the way it worked out with the internet, it festered more, and it's now it's not exactly brought out to the light, but it's like everything's in the corners, little corners here, little corners there. So yeah, that's a difficult question to answer as far as speech. I wonder what the right answer is for that. But
Yeah.
you're right, as far as legitimacy goes, and like who's making these decisions and such. I mean, I think to an extent of it, the way I look at it is with comedy particularly, the people are always making the decision. It's a matter of finding out who, or you know the people have spoken always on comedy. They've spoken for a long time on how relevant they think it is. But when it comes to certain decision makers in various parts of our government, and I guess as it goes around the world and whatnot, hopefully we're going to get to a point where we'll get more people listening to what the powers that be, listening to what it is that the people find important. And
For sure.
and at some point they have to recognize that what the people find important, maybe the people aren't completely wrong. Maybe we should listen to the people on this every once in a while. And so when something is popular and relevant like that, it should be taken seriously, to say the least, as seriously as everything else, artistically. So traversing that and getting through is definitely our biggest challenge. So part of it is I always kind of take solace in the fact is, like, part of it is us being here, us never being here. I mean, we're here as comedians, but until you're here with an association to say, hey, this we should have a part of this pie and we should be fostering this. That's music industry is very aspirational that way, because they did a great job of that all the way through, Canadian music industry particularly. And that's how we were able to produce so many great artists.
Yeah, and it sounds like, yeah, you're kind of adopting that model, which makes a lot of sense, but then trying to kind of tailor it to what comedy is and does, and what it can, the kinds of spaces that it creates, and the sorts of thinking that it potentiates. Like, I think that's the thing I find so exciting about comedy is it is a unique art form, and yet one that is like, you can see it evolving in real time, right? People that kind of break the form, people that play with the form. I love all of that so much. So
it's great. It's those differences between, like, say, comedy and music, as much as the similarities, you're always going to have those differences where, one that always stands out to me is that, people will play a song forever, and bands will come in and people are angry that they're not playing all their old shit. And
right.
Comedy's the exact opposite. Try to come with the same, have Bill Burr come back with the same set 5 different times and see how it goes,
Yeah, that's a good point, And then, I mean, I know there are certain comedians that, like Seinfeld, for example, like he would do the same jokes for a long time. And like, they'll talk about how they sometimes want comedians to like do the hits. But that, I think you're totally right, is not the orthodoxy by any means right now when it comes to comedy.
No.
An audience that knows the joke, it's certain to not land. There's just no way it's going to have the same impact, right? Because part of it is just the element of unpredictability, surprise, pulling the rug out.
Yeah, the element of surprise. You can't. It's the opposite of music in that the familiarity, as much as it might be liked, you can like a song a million times, but you're never surprised by a song. The 100th time, but you don't care.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll say that, like, if there's a special that I really love, Kurt Braunohler is playing Just for Laughs, and he has a great Comedy Central special called Trust Me. I'll rewatch that, but I won't rewatch it like right away. In the same way that I'll put on an album like
sure
a few consecutive days. It just wouldn't make any sense. I think you're right. That is an interesting contrast there. But yeah, I won't take any more of your time. This has been really, really great.
Oh, take my time. It's been nothing but a pleasure, man.
All right. No, I appreciate it.